This is lecture 128 on the Battle for Berlin in 1945, and it's the last lecture in the series that is supporting Volume 7, Communism in Europe, which I'm putting together now and should be available, I would guess, in a couple of weeks on Amazon Kindle. At any rate, this lecture 128 on the Battle for Berlin I'm going to open on April 22nd of 1945, because by that time the entire 300 square miles of Berlin had been encircled by the Red Army. Its 1.7 million population had about half of them had left the city, and 43,000 artillery pieces and 15,000 Katyusha truck-mounted rocket carriers were on the entire perimeter, focused on their particular targets. And on April 22nd at 9:45, the loudspeakers announced that the assault was going to begin. And actually what they said was open fire on the capital of fascist Germany, which they did. And the firing did not stop for days, which shows you how much ammunition they had stored up for this. And it only stopped then because the 2.5 million Red Army men and their 20,000 T-34 tanks and 8,000 warplanes had crushed the Nazi units too close. They were too close to them for the barrage to continue. So by the night of April 30th, that bombardment had shifted, and now it was local bombardment by guys pulling howitzers and driving them and that sort of thing. Howitzers is a small cannon, field piece. By the night of April 30th, Red Army men were getting ready to hoist the red banner of socialism over the Reichstag building. The Nazis themselves had set a fire in 1933. So, on May 1st, 1945, International Workers of the World Day, the war in Europe was over. Now, since the previous chapter in this volume, and lectures supporting it, how had the last few months been spent on the Western Front of the USSR? Well, to begin with, the Red Army, as you will recall, had already taken care of the northern route into fascist Germany, and had gone through Poland, and we went through that in the last lecture. Now, but they also have to come in from the south, that is from Hungary. So now that takes us back to the Hungarian People's Republic. That was the outcome of 35 years of class struggle that began when Vladimir Lenin sent Bela Kun, as you may recall, to organize the second Bolshevik seizure of power in the world in November of 1918. Kun created the Republic of Councils, or Soviets, of Hungary in 1919. It was the first communist government created after the Russian communist or Bolshevik government, which became the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, or Russian RSFSR, after 1924 in the USSR. But at any rate, meanwhile, the Russian Bolsheviks had stumbled in their war communism policy toward the peasantry. In the post-Civil War months, Lenin had had to spread a retreat to the restoration of capitalist social relations in the countryside of the Soviet Republic, that is, of Bolshevik Russia. Now, that retreat was named the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Now, unfortunately for the Hungarian Bolsheviks, the NEP retreat came too late. In Hungary, Kun's Communist Army had done very well at first, but then, when the peasants realized that war communism was meant to be permanent socialism in agriculture, they deserted to the enemy. Thus, Hungary under Admiral Nicholas Horthy became the first fascist country in Europe, even before Mussolini had coined the term. Now, Hungarian communists had to go underground, and their contact with the world revolution thereafter had been through the intelligence division of the Comintern, run by Joseph Stalin at Lenin's direction, as we have already covered in previous chapters and lectures, since the Comintern's founding in 1919. Now, on the 27th of June 1941, bringing us up to the war, Hungary declared war on the USSR and sent divisions to help the Krauts. On the 1st of July 1941, attached to the Nazi 17th Army assault, the Hungarian Carpathian Group attacked the 12th Soviet Army and advanced into Soviet Ukraine and southern Russia. From the 3rd to the 8th of August of 41, the Carpathian Group Mechanized Corps acted as one half of a pincer that encircled the 6th Soviet Army and the 12th Soviet Army. In the Battle of Uman, 20 Soviet divisions were captured or destroyed in this action. In July of 41, the Hungarian government transferred responsibility for 18,000 Jews from Carpato-Ruthenian Hungary to the German armed forces. These Jews were sent to Kamenets-Podolsky, where they were shot by Nazi mobile killing units. Hungary's fascist regime passed the Third Jewish Law in August of 41, prohibiting marriage and sexual intercourse of Hungarians with Jews. 6 months after the mass murder of Kamenets-Podolsky, Hungarian troops killed 3,000 Serbian and Jewish hostages at Novi Sad, Yugoslavia, in reprisal for resistance. Horthy's new Prime Minister, Miklos Kele, continued supporting Germany against the Red Army. So by August of 42, tens of thousands of Hungarians were fighting the Red Army on its western front. Then during the Battle of Stalingrad, the Hungarian Second Army suffered horrible losses, just as terrible as those suffered by their neighbors, the Romanians, when the Soviets broke through at the Don River and sliced directly through the Hungarian units. In February of 43, the Hungarian Second Army was crushed by the Soviets at the Battle of Voronezh, where bewildered Hungarian troops turned and fled. 100,000 died. Those that survived were taken prisoner by the Red Army, and the Hungarian army had ceased to exist, at least in Russia or in the Soviet Union. In March of 1944, Hitler launched German Nazi troops into occupied Hungary. Now, Dom Szathmáry, a dyed-in-the-wool Hitlerite, became the new prime minister, governing under Nazi military ruler Edmund Wiesenmayer. In May 44, the communist-led Magyar Front demanded a new struggle of liberation against the German occupation forces and their collaborators, and called for the creation of a new democratic Hungary after the war. As the Soviets pushed westward, Stoly's government proceeded to conscript new armies. The Hungarian troops again suffered terrible losses. Between June and September of 44, the Wehrmacht had lost more than 1 million men, and it lacked the fuel and armaments needed to operate effectively. In August of 44, Horthy replaced Stolyjoy with a less fascist general named Géza Lakatos. In September of 44, Soviet forces crossed the Hungarian border, and on the 15th of October 44, Horthy announced that Hungary had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. The Germans forced Horthy to abrogate the armistice and depose the Lakatos government, and they named the leader of the Arrow Cross Party, Ferenc Szalasi, as Prime Minister of the new Government of National Unity. Arrow Cross was the name of the fascist party equivalent to the Nazi party in Hungary. On 11 November 44, the Committee of Liberation of the Hungarian National Uprising launched an uprising against the Nazi forces. In cooperation with the Nazis, Szalasi resumed deportations of Jews. The Arrow Cross launched a reign of terror against the Jews of Budapest. Thousands were tortured, raped, and murdered in the last months of the war, and their property looted or destroyed. Of the 800,000 Jews resident within Hungary's expanded borders of 1941, only 200,000 survived the Holocaust. An estimated 28,000 Hungarian Roma were also killed. Horthy had been taken to Germany and survived the war, spending his last years in fascist Portugal, where he died in 1957. From 6 October to 29 October 44, during the Battle of Debrecen, the newly manned Hungarian Third Army fought 3 Soviet tank corps losing all of its armor and heavy artillery. In October of 44, the Hungarian First Army was attached to the German First Panzer Army and fought against the Red Army's advance toward Budapest. On the 1st of December 44, the reconstituted Hungarian Second Army was defeated and its remnants incorporated into the Third Army. On the 28th of December 44, a provisional government was in Hungary under Prime Minister Bela Miklos. The German Nazis and fascist Hungarians loyal to Selassie fought on. On 29 December 44, the Soviets and Romanians completed the encirclement of Budapest. In the siege of Budapest, the Hungarian army was destroyed 120 miles north of Budapest in a running battle from 1 January to 16 February 45. On January 45, representatives of the Miklos provisional government signed an armistice in Moscow, and 32,000 Germans within Hungary were arrested and transported to labor camps in the Donetsk Basin. On 13 February 45, the remaining Hungarian and German units within Budapest surrendered, and by the 1st of April 44, the Nazis and the Arrow Cross were gone. Now, through Poland. On the 12th of January 45, the Red Army began the Vistula-Oder offensive across the Nehru River, and from Warsaw it drove with 4 army fronts or groups for 3 days. On the 4th day it moved 25 miles per day, taking East Prussia, Danzig, and Poznan, drawing up 37 miles east of Berlin along the Oder River, and it then drove on to Pomerania, clearing the right bank of the Oder River into Silesia. From Hungary, on the 13th of February 45, Budapest was liberated, and on the 30th of March 45, the Soviets entered Austria, and in the Vienna offensive, they captured Vienna on 13 April 45. Surrounding Berlin itself. During 1945, the U.S. Army Air Force launched large daytime raids on Berlin. For 36 nights, scores of RAF Mosquitoes bombed the German capital, ending the night of 2021 April 45, just before the Soviets entered the city. Otherwise, the capture of Berlin was an all-Soviet show. For the assault from the Soviet west onto Berlin, the Red Army had amassed 193 divisions of 2.5 million men and materiel on their side of the Oder River. They had with them 7,500 airplanes and 43,000 artillery pieces, and more was on its way. The first crowd obstacle was the fortified Seelow Heights, 11 miles west of the Oder River and 56 miles east of Berlin. Nazi engineers turned the Oder's already saturated floodplain into a swamp by releasing the water from a reservoir upstream. Behind the plain, on a plateau, their engineers built 3 belts of defenses reaching the outskirts of Berlin, each line made of anti-tank ditches, anti-tank guns, and a network of trenches and bunkers. On 9 April 1945, Königsberg in East Prussia fell to the Red Army, and Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front moved west to the east bank of the Oder River. Marshal George Zhukov deployed the 1st Belarusian Front in front of the Seelow Heights. The 2nd Belarusian Front then moved into the positions being vacated by the 1st Belarusian Front north of the Seelow Heights, and to the south, Marshal Konev shifted the main weight of the 1st Ukrainian Front to the Neisse River. Now, 3 Soviet army groups had 2.5 million men, including 78,556 soldiers of the 1st Polish Army. With them were 6,250 tanks. (7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, 3,255 trunk-mounted Katyusha rocket launchers, and 95,383 motor vehicles. So at the Battle of the Oder-Neisse from 16 to 19 April 1945, 1 million Red Army soldiers and more than 20,000 tanks and artillery pieces were deployed to break through the gates of Berlin. Against them, for their last stand, were 100,000 German soldiers and their 1,200 tanks and guns. The Soviet forces, led by Zhukov, broke through the defensive positions at the cost of 30,000 dead. During April 1945, the fourth day, the First Belarusian Front broke through the final line of the Seelow Heights. Fleeing Germans lay between them and Berlin. The First Ukrainian Front ran after them into open country. One powerful thrust by Gordov's 3rd Guards Army and Rebelko's 3rd and Ilyushenko's 4th Guards tank armies were heading northeast toward Berlin. Other Red armies headed west toward a section of the U.S. Army's front line southwest of Berlin on the Elbe River. The Reds drove a wedge between the German Army Group Vistula in the north and relabeled Army Group Center in the south. By the end of the day, the German Eastern Front line ceased to exist. 2 Soviet fronts enveloped the Crown's 9th Army west of Frankfurt, and the overall cost to the Reds included 2,800 tanks lost between 1 and 19 April. On the 20th of April 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet artillery of the First Belarusian Front began shelling Berlin and did not stop until the day the city surrendered. The weight of the ordnance delivered by Soviet artillery during the battle was greater than the total tonnage dropped by Western Allied bombers on the city in the entire war. While the First Belarusian Front advanced toward the east and northeast of the city, the First Ukrainian Front pushed through the last formations of the northern wing of Army Group Center and passed north of Jüterbog, well over halfway to the U.S. front line on the River Elbe at Magdeburg. To the north, between Stettin and Schwedt, the Second Belarusian Front attacked the northern flank of Army Group Vistula, held by the 3rd Panzer Army. The next day, Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army advanced 31 miles north of Berlin, attacking southwest of Wernichen. The Soviet plan was to encircle Berlin first and then envelop the 9th Army. Approaching the city. While the First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front encircled Berlin and started the battle for the city itself, Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front started his offensive to the north of Berlin, and on the 20th of April 45, between Stettin and Schwedt, his 2nd Belarusian Front attacked the northern flank of Nazi Army Group Vistula, held by the 3rd Panzer Army. 2 days later, on 22nd of April 45, the 2nd Belarusian Front had established a 10-mile-wide bridgehead on the east bank of the Oder and was heavily engaged with the 3rd Panzer Army. On the 25th of April 45, the 2nd Belarusian Front broke through the 3rd Panzer Army's line around the bridgehead south of Stettin. It then crossed the Radobrunk Swamp and moved west toward Montgomery's British 21st Army Group and north toward the Baltic port of Strassen. The Nazi 3rd Panzer Army and 21st Army to the north of Berlin retreated west under relentless pressure from Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front. It was forced into a pocket 20 miles wide that stretched from the Elbe to the coast. To its west was the British 21st Army Group. To its east, Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front. To the south was the U.S. 9th Army at Ludwigslust and Schwerin. On 25 April 45, the Ukrainian Army Group occupied most of the area south and southwest of Berlin. Their spearheads had met elements of the 1st Belarusian Front west of Berlin, completing the encirclement of the city. And meanwhile, the 58th Guards Rifle Division of the 5th Guards Army in 1st Ukrainian Front made contact with the U.S. 69th Infantry Division of the U.S. 1st Army near Torgau on the Elbe River. Kraut forces south of Berlin have been smashed into 3 parts. The 9th Army surrounded the Halbe pocket. Wenck's 12th Army was attempting to force its way into Berlin from the southwest against the 1st Ukrainian Front of Potsdam. and Schorner's newly labeled Army Group Center was forced to withdraw towards Czechoslovakia. Between 24 April and 1 May 45, the Ninth Army tried and failed to break out of the pocket in an attempt to link up with the 12th Army. At dawn on 28 April 45, the men from the officer training schools covered a distance of about 15 miles. The Reds stopped them at the tip of Lake Seelow, southwest of Potsdam and 20 miles from Berlin. That night, General Wenck reported to the Kraut High Command at Fürstenberg that his 12th Army had been forced back along the entire front. No attack on Berlin was possible, and support from the Ninth Army could no longer be expected. In the meantime, about 25,000 German soldiers of the Ninth Army, with several thousand civilians, ran to the lines of the 12th Army after breaking out of the Halbe pocket. 30,000 Germans were buried after the battle in the cemetery at Halbe. About 20,000 soldiers of the Red Army also died. These are the known dead. The remnants of more than that died in the battle are found every year. So the total of those who died may never be known, nor how many civilians died. Meanwhile, the 12th Army's bridgehead, with its headquarters in the park of Schönhausen, came after heavy Soviet artillery bombardment was compressed into an area 5 by 1¼ miles. The command of the German 5th Corps, trapped with the 9th Army north of Forst, passed from the 4th Panzer to the 9th Army. The 5th Corps was still holding on to Berlin-Kotbus Highway. From the relabeled Army Group Center, launched a counteroffensive aimed at Berlin from the south against the 1st Ukrainian Front region, engaging the 2nd Polish Army and elements of the Red Army's 52nd Army and 5th Armed Guards Army, but it failed. The 2nd Belarusian Front established a bridgehead 9 miles deep on the west bank of the Oder and engaged the 3rd Panzer Army. The 9th Kraut Army then lost Cottbus. A Soviet armor spearhead was on the Havel River east of Berlin, and another Red armor spearhead had penetrated the inner defensive ring of Berlin. The capital was now within range of field artillery, and then came the tremendous words, "Open fire on the capital of fascist Germany," on all the loudspeakers around the 300 square miles now surrounded by the Red Army of Berlin. At 8:30 a.m. on 22 April, a Soviet journalist noted the time. 96 shells fell in the center of Berlin in the course of a few minutes. On 23 April 45, the Soviet 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front tightened the encirclement, severing the last link between the German 9th Army and the city. Elements of the 1st Ukrainian Front moved westward and started to engage the Kraut 9th Army, moving towards Berlin. The 1st Shock Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army assaulted Berlin from the southeast, overcoming the Nazi 56th Panzer Corps. The Reds reached the Berlin Inner Ring Railway to the north side of the Teltow Canal by the evening of 24 April. And on that day of 24 April 45, elements of the 1st Belarusian Front and the 1st Ukrainian Front completed the encirclement of the city. So the next day, on 25 April 45, the leading Soviet units penetrated the armed defensive ring, and by the end of the day, it was clear that the German defense could only temporarily delay the capture of the city. The decisive stages of the battle had already been fought and lost by the Nazis outside the city. Yet to be destroyed were 45,000 soldiers, supplemented by the police force, boys in the compulsory Hitler Youth, and the Volkssturm Old Folks Home men. To the west of the city was the 20th Infantry Division. To the north of the city was the 9th Parachute Division. To the northeast of the city was the Panzer Division Munkenberg, and to the southeast of the city and to the east of Tempelhof Airport was the 11th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland. The reserve 18th Panzer Grenadier Division was in Berlin's Central District. On the 26th of April 45, Zhukov's 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army fought their way through the southern suburbs and attacked Tempelhof Airport, just inside the inner defensive ring, and prepared to destroy the Munkenberg Division. You'll recall that Zhukov was the general in charge of the defense of Stalingrad, and he wrote a book about it called The Battle of Stalingrad, and he also wrote a book about this called The Battle for Berlin. And I would recommend, since they're both in English, I'd recommend that you get those and read them, which you could get on interlibrary loan if nothing else. On 27 April 1945, the Munkenberg and Nordland divisions faced 5 Soviet armies. They were from east to west: the 5th Shock Army, the 8th Guards Army of Zhukov, the 1st Guards Tank Army, and 3rd Guards Tank Army. The Krauts were forced back to Hermannplatz and the Reichstag. In the early hours of 29 April 1945, the Soviet 3rd Shock Army crossed the Moltke Bridge into the surrounding streets and bridges and buildings, and at 0400 hours in the Führer bunker, Hitler signed his last will and testament, and shortly afterwards married Eva Braun. At dawn, the Soviets pressed on with their assault in the southeast. After very heavy fighting, they captured Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse. To the southwest, the 8th Guards Army of Zhukov attacked north across the Landwehr Canal site into the Tiergarten. All three of the generals had agreed with with Marshal Zhukov, that Zhukov, given his heroic defense of Stalingrad, should be given the opportunity to lead the attack on the Führer bunker in the downtown central area itself, and so he's in the front line of that. On the 30th of April 1945 at 0600 hours, the Soviets launched that attack on the Reichstag, and that evening the Soviets were able to enter the building. The Reichstag had not been in use since the Nazis burned it down in February 1933 as part of their plot to justify seizing total power and simultaneously blaming their favorite enemies, the Communists and the Jews. The fascists were entrenched, and room-to-room fighting was now required on the 30th of April, but they were on the building and on the top, so that afternoon Hitler and Braun committed suicide. Their bodies were burned near the bunker. Hitler's last will and testament made Admiral Karl Donitz the President of Germany and Joseph Goebbels the new Chancellor of Germany. Well, not that these guys are going to have a chance to ever take any power. On the 1st of May 1945, the Reds stormed the top of the Reichstag and hoisted the red flag of the International Workers' Day and of the workers' first world government. The photograph became symbols of Soviet victory in the Battle of Berlin, and Western Front hostilities had ended with the total Soviet victory. In the early hours of 1 May, General Zhukov, commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army, was told of Hitler's death. In the afternoon, Goebbels and his wife killed their children and then themselves. And on the night of 1 to 2 May 45, remnants of the Berlin garrison tried and failed to break out of the city center in 3 different directions. Most were killed or captured by the Red Army's outer encirclement forces west of the city. General Weidling surrendered with his staff at 0600 hours, and he was taken to see General Vasily Zhukov at 8:23, where Weidling ordered the city's defenders to surrender to the Soviets. Where SS troops refused to surrender, the Reds reduced their hideouts to rubble. On the 2nd May of 45, the Red Army controlled the entire Reichstag building. On the night of 2 to 3 May, the 3rd Panzer Army and the 21st Army surrendered to the U.S. Army. 2nd Army surrendered to the Soviets on 9 May, and on the morning of 7 May, 12th Army surrendered to the U.S. 9th Army. Soviet forces sustained 81,116 dead, 280,251 wounded. The Red Army lost 1,997 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Soviets killed 458,080 Krauts and captured 479,298. The Red Army's Occupation Authority, RAOA, appointed local Germans to head each city block and organize the cleaning up. The RAOA made the necessary effort to feed the residents of the city. Both surrendered soldiers and civilians were grateful to receive the food issued at Red Army soup kitchens. On January 1945, the average Berliner was getting 64% of the daily ration of 1,240 calories. 1 million people were homeless. Then Austrian politician Karl Renner in Austria established contact with the Soviets. Joseph Stalin had already built a post-war Austrian cabinet from the country's communists in Russia, but Tolbogin's telegram changed Stalin's mind in favor of Renner. On 20 April 1945, the Soviets instructed Renner to form a provisional government. Soviet acceptance of Renner was the Austrian manifestation of the Red Army G5, that is the section of the Army in the U.S. that appoints local mayors whenever they occupy an area, and you know, in general the local administrative staff is handled by G5. G1, 2, 3, and 4 are all elements of the Army devoted to the war itself. Now, on 27 April, Kenner's government took office, declared the independence of Austria from Nazi Germany, and called for the creation of a democratic state along the lines of the First Austrian Republic. Kenner and his ministers were guarded and by the Czech Secret Service protection men. 1/3 of State Chancellor Renner's cabinet, including crucial seats of the Secretary of State of the Interior and the Secretary of State for Education, was staffed by Austrian communists. The Western caps would not recognize Renner, as FDR was dead and Truman had reversed his entire foreign policy to favor anti-communism. The British were particularly hostile. However, Renner had secured inter-party control by designating 2 undersecretaries of state in each of these ministries appointed by the 2 parties, not placing the Secretary of State. On 23 May 1945, the Cheka reported arrests of 268 former Red Army men, 1,208 Wehrmacht men, 1,655 civilians, and in the following weeks the British surrendered over 40,000 Cossacks who had fled to Western Australia because they'd been fighting against the Red Army. In July of August 1945, the Soviets brought in 4 regiments of NKVD troops to mop up Vienna and seal the Czechoslovak border. The Red Army lost 17,000 men in lives in the Battle of Vienna. Now, on Czechoslovakia, the German SS and Gestapo troops were resisting the USSR 4th and 1st Ukrainian fronts, especially in Czechoslovakia. Now, this is before, during, and after Hitler's death and the collapse of his regime. The Nazi regime considered Czechoslovakia a fallback area in case of losing Berlin, and in early 1945 they had concentrated the 6th SS Panzer Army, 1st and 4th Panzer Armies, the 7th, 8th, and 17th Combined Armies there in Czechoslovakia. They were guarding the proposed new headquarters of the new Nazi government and German High Command. From 30 April to 1 May 1945, SS Senior Group Leader and General of Police and Waffen SS General Karl Hermann Frank announced over the radio in Prague that they would drown any uprising in a sea of blood. Frank knew that several Red Army groups were advancing on Prague, and running from them were 2 divisions of Russian traitors, these KONR Cossacks that had been recruited by the Nazis to fight the Red Army. On 1 May 1945, as Berlin was subdued, Stalin issued orders directing the 1st Belarusian Front to relieve the 1st Ukrainian Front in the Berlin area. The Ukrainian Army Group Front was joined by the 4th Ukrainian Front, attacking south along the Mulde River and drive on Prague. That the offensive was a military event involving serious combat is made clear by the over 50,000 casualties suffered by Soviet forces and their allies from 6 to 11 May of 1945. Published in 2008, Volume 10/1 of the German Official History of the War criticizes the Soviet view of the event, noting the percentages of casualties of the Prague offensive to be far lower than that of the Berlin offensive, and the German official history makes note of Stalin's political intentions and his desire to prevent Army Group Center from surrounding two U.S. forces. And in other words, this whole German history, official history thing, just reflects the position of U.S. academic imperialism today. There are unofficial histories that touch upon the offensive, and I'm not going to go into all those right now. I'm going to just kind of conclude this lecture with, on the 29th of March 1945, the Soviet commander Fyodor Tobukhin's troops crossed the former Austrian front border at Kloster-Marienburg in Burgenland, and on 3 April, at the beginning of the month, the Prague offensive destroyed Army Group Center and the parts of Army Group Osmor. And these army groups were the last large, intact military formations of Germany, and followed the offensive. All surviving German soldiers became prisoners of war or fugitives. The number of prisoners is another matter over which there's quite a bit of discussion in the book, and I'm not really going to go into all of that here. I just want to point out that the main thing here is the Nazis, the death of Hitler and the surrender of the Führer bunker and so on in Berlin did not mean that the entire Nazi party or military organization were going to do any such thing, and they had gone already prepared to hide out in Czechoslovakia. They had sent a huge military force there before Berlin fell, and now their intention is to recreate, I guess, what they might call a Fourth Reich. I don't know, but Stalin's not going to let that happen. So he's chased them on into Czechoslovakia, and there's a lot about that in this book, and I'm not going to go over it all here because there really isn't any point. By the 9th to the 11th of May, all these Nazis in Czechoslovakia had been rounded up and killed, and that was pretty much the end of the war at that point, and the beginning of the so-called Cold War, which was almost immediate because FDR was dead, Truman was president, he had officially replaced the pro-Soviet attitudes of the previous government with his own anti-communist views, which were, of course, right in line with those of his longtime boss, Meyer Lansky, who was the boss of his major local crime boss in Kansas City. But at any rate, we've gone through all of that in previous lectures and, of course, in previous volumes. So what I'm going to do now is just wrap this story of Berlin up, and you can see it didn't take them long after they whipped them in Stalingrad. It was, well, first of all, they whipped them in Moscow, then Stalingrad, then on the Kursk salient, and then finally they drove them all the way through Eastern Europe into Berlin itself. The Nazis made an attempt to continue without Hitler after Hitler, but they, even though they had amassed a huge military force in Czechoslovakia, it was not, I think they might have had perhaps 100,000 men there with their tanks and equipment. But you got to remember that the Russians have got an 11 million man army surrounding them. So there isn't any weight that, even if you wanted to lose, you couldn't do it against that sort of weight. Now, just to comment on what's coming up next, I've decided that since I apparently have the time, I'm going to try and do Volume 8 on the peoples in North America prior to white contact, which, of course, is probably where I could have started, given the fact that I'm a prehistorian and an archaeologist, but at any rate we didn't. So there will be, assuming I have enough time left to finish this 8th volume, I will have left this behind for you. And I hope that at least one person somewhere in the world will be sufficiently educated by these 8 volumes, or 7, depending on how long it takes me to finish this 8th one, to pick up the glove and carry the battle forward from here. So I guess at that point what I better do is say thank you, and I will see you again when we start giving lectures on Volume 8, The Peoples of North America Prior to White Contact.